Dr. Julie Trebilcock, Brunel, and Dr. Liz Riley at Betknowmore UK, who are going to talk to us for about half an hour about the research, holding it all together, picking up the pieces, women's experience with gambling and crime, and then we're going to open up to some questions. So I think Julie and Liz have said if you do have questions which you can't wait until the end for as they go through, pop them into chat, and Vanessa and I will keep an eye out for that. But there will be plenty of time after we hear the presentation for questions. So do put your hands up at the end or pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up as we go forward. And as Vanessa's already said, this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera and just join, pop your video off. Yeah, so over to you both.
So hello everybody. On behalf of Julie and I, thank you very much for having us. I'm going to start off by just spending about 5 minutes or so kind of setting the context for the research, and Julie's going to focus on the findings. So in 2019, the Howard League set up the Commission on Crime and Gambling Related Harms, and that was funded by, I think somebody's got their hand up already. Is there a technical issue?
Yeah,
No?
sorry, the slides aren't moving. I don't know if that's just me.
No, that's fine. We're not at the stage yet. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and then we'll start to crack on with the slides.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, the funding comes from the Gambling Commission, and the commission itself was chaired by Lord Goldsmith, along with 11 other commissioners who are academics, professionals from the criminal justice system, public health, people with lived experience of gambling harms, and people who know about the gambling sector. And the purpose of the commission was to really explore the links between crime and gambling harms, but also the kind of impact, the broader impact on communities and society as a whole, and how people affected by gambling harms could be actually diverted from the criminal justice system. So it aimed to look at I had 3 questions: the links between gambling harms and crime, the impact on society and communities, and what should be done. So they started off by initiating a literature review, but then went on to commission 6 research projects in total. And these included a project on gambling culture within a men's prison, a project on police awareness of gambling harms, and also a project focusing on magistrates and their understanding of crime related to gambling. In 2021, it commissioned Lauren Smith from Lincoln University to undertake research on lived experiences of crime and gambling with a focus on probation services. And that project involved kind of semi-structured interviews with 22 people. But what quickly became apparent to the Howard League was that the majority of people who were coming forward to participate in the research were white men. And the lived experience of other groups was harder to capture. And that's where this project was born. So the Howard League decided to commission 2 more pieces of research to capture a greater diversity of experience. So one of them looking at ethnic minority communities, gambling harms and crime. And that was led by Geraldine Brown of Coventry University. And that was the sister project to this one that we're going to be talking about today, which is Women, Crime and Gambling Harms, which was led by Julie. And she's shortly going to present the findings of the project. So Julie, if you could just whip onto the second slide, please. So the commission actually established the research questions for the project on women, crime and gambling harms. And I'm not going to go through them all, but as you can see from them, just 2 of them actually focus on women's experiences of crime in the criminal justice system and their relationship to gambling. And generally, there is that broader focus on societal harms that impact women due to gambling, and also on their experiences of treatment and support services. However, given the time constraints of this session, Julie's just going to talk about the findings that relate to the questions on crime and the criminal justice system. But before she goes on to do that, I think the last thing to say is that the Howard League also specified that this project and the Ethnic Minorities Project had to be peer research projects. So Julie, if you could go to the third slide, please. So the first thing we did using our networks, and this is really how Betknowmore UK got involved in this project, was that we started to recruit peer researchers. And eventually we had a team of 4 women with lived experience, either as gamblers in recovery who also had experience of crime, or as women harmed by somebody else's gambling, what we call in the sector affected others. And they became our team of peer researchers. So initially we invited them to London, where we held a participatory research design session and provided some training on participatory methods. And they reflected more generally upon the research topic. And the peer researchers not only took part in some of the research interviews, especially with the stakeholders, but there were also research participants themselves. So they completed reflective diaries, in-depth interviews, and they also took part in participatory analysis sessions. And in total, 27 participants took part in the research, and there were a mixture of affected others, women who had engaged in crime and disordered gambling, and also a range of stakeholders. So I'm going to hand over to Julie now, and she's going to talk to you about the findings of the project.
Thanks, Liz, and hi, everybody. So as Liz has, I think, kind of very helpfully pointed out, there's a range of different participants in the study. As you'll see, it was a kind of in-depth qualitative study, and what we really wanted to do was just essentially achieve a much better understanding about how gambling and crime, broadly conceived, really might come together in the experiences of women. And just looking at that breakdown of participants there, as you'll see, we spoke to, not only women who were in recovery from gambling, who disclosed having committed crime, sometimes related to that gambling, but some people obviously also disclosed having committed crime that hadn't been prosecuted. We've also spoken with people who we describe as affected others, and then stakeholder participants. And as you can probably see from the breakdown there was, of course, overlap from some of those different groups. And in fact, I can think of at least 1 or 2 participants who perhaps were would meet the criteria for all of those groups. They were not only affected others, but they'd also had experience of disordered gambling, and they were also now working in services. So we were very interested, as I say, to try and unpick how gambling and crime linked to women. So what I'm going to try and do is focus mainly on some of our key findings, with a particular focus, as Liz said, on its perhaps relevance to crime, whether that's perhaps crime that women disclosed having committed themselves, or perhaps crime that they've essentially been victim to, because as I've already highlighted, we obviously understand that direction could be quite complex, and the relationship can go in many different ways. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking about the participants who disclosed having previously gambled, and then also having committed crime, most often related to that gambling, but not always. And then I'll turn on to say a little bit more about the affected others in our study, who were a really important group of women to also speak to, and actually had lots to say about their experiences of crime, but also the criminal justice system. And then the final area that I'll focus on today is really about women's experiences of the criminal justice system, whether they were women who had been prosecuted and convicted of a crime, most often related to their gambling, or if they were women who'd been affected by the gambling of others. So starting with the women who had disclosed previous gambling and crime linked to that gambling, as you might expect, there were really quite diverse trajectories into disordered gambling, and I suppose ultimately into that turn to crime. And that was one of the really interesting aspects, I think, of the research, was just how different some of those trajectories could be. Some women spoke about gambling really from quite an early age, certainly in the teenage years onwards, often in quite positive and in kind of quite almost terms that you wouldn't describe as being problematic, something that people did with their families, something that they didn't sort of see as an addiction, something that they saw as being relatively harmless in those early stages. But sort of in contrast, some women actually described really having very limited engagement with gambling through their lives. And there was kind of notably several women who really hadn't started gambling until much later, sometimes in their 50s. That was very interesting to look at some of the reasons why those trajectories differed. What we found broadly that perhaps all of the women did have in common, despite some of those different experiences and exposures to gambling through their lives, was that the kind of escalation of gambling, the point at which it became, really problematic for their lives, and ultimately the point at which they perhaps then turned to crime, often really kind of followed, as you can see from the slide, either a build-up of different stress and trauma in their lives, or significantly a big win. So lots of women spoke, for example, about winning lots and lots of money, a big sum, whether it was in the casino or in a bingo or through a TV competition, and about that big win really being a kind of tipping point, where they then started to spend more and more time and obviously money on gambling. The kind of first thing that I mentioned around this build-up of stress and trauma really just, it was very, very interesting to kind of unpick this, and particularly to look at it in a much more perhaps gendered way and look at some of those different stresses and traumas in women's lives. So particularly for women who perhaps had gambled for many, many years in ways that they didn't see as problematic, what was clear when it sort of turned to a point of escalation was that there was just a build-up of far too many things at one point. And it was very rare to see one of those on their own. There were lots of different ones. So if I just look at some of the quotes that we've got from our participants, you can see a whole range of different challenges that women are experiencing and trying to kind of manage on a day-to-day basis. So if we look, for example, at Hannah in the top right-hand corner, she's talking about her partner's drinking escalating after the birth of their first child, finding herself increasingly caring for that child on her own, and really turning to gambling as an escapism, partly because she could no longer go out and occasionally see friends at the bingo. And actually one of the ways that she was trying to kind of hold it all together and keep everything going was by using online gambling, particularly as a kind of escapism. As you'll see from some of the other quotes there, women also talked about a number of other different stresses and traumas, and these were often, as I say, quite gendered. So they related to caring responsibilities, either for young children, a bit like Hannah, or perhaps for family members who were often dealing with, kind of increasing health problems and so on. So there was a really clear link between kind of caring responsibilities and women's increasing turn to gambling. And we also found that, there's a range of different things on there around people's relationships. We've seen from Hannah that she describes how her partner's drinking is starting to increase, and that's becoming quite problematic. But other women sometimes talked about quite coercive or abusive relationships where they were, again, using gambling almost as an escape, ultimately. You'll see from the second bullet point, we talked about physical and mental health here. Women described a range of different physical and mental health problems that they felt were relevant to their gambling. And one of the challenges in this research was really trying to unpick what was kind of driving the gambling and actually what was a direct harm of the gambling. And I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that. These things were often working in tandem in many respects. But women described, a range of different kind of health problems in relation to not only the menopause, but also eating disorders, experiences of cancer, and also increasing problems with their mental health. Perhaps the final point I'll make on this slide, and I'll kind of come back to this through the presentation, is that, just as I've highlighted that women's experiences of coercive control and abusive relationships can be sometimes, linked to their escalation in gambling, you can see that there are also direct experiences. There's a quote from an anonymized woman there who told a very harrowing story about losing all of her money at a casino, and then that being followed by a very serious sexual assault, which actually kind of led to her increasingly gambling, and ultimately she discloses, as you can see, committing fraud. So in terms of how women describe their gambling, we kind of identified perhaps 4 themes, which I'm sure will be familiar to many participants in the room, but they were kind of really very, very strong themes that kind of cut across the different participant accounts. So women often described gambling in terms of a kind of source of hope, as a means of perhaps making their lives better, or of trying to get themselves out of the particular situation that they were in. So again, we kind of see the quote from Hannah at the top there. She talks about being a single mum, and she's gambling on the one hand because, in her words, she needs that fix, but also that she really wants to create a kind of great life for her and her son. So gambling for many women appeared to represent a kind of really clear source of hope. And I think linked to hope was this sense that gambling was also a potential method of escapism for women. And what was very striking across the accounts was, women often describe their experiences of gambling in terms of the noise and the participation of it, with the kind of lights and flashing lights and noises and so on in quite visually powerful ways. But when they also described gambling, it was almost a kind of described as a very quiet and safe space, somewhere where they could be on their own, where they could have their own time, where they could perhaps escape some of those wider challenges that I've alluded to in the previous slide. The third way that we found women described gambling, and I think links very clearly to women's deteriorating mental health sometimes, was gambling really as a form of self-harm and as a way to self-destruct. This sense that those increasing stresses and traumas that I've touched on were really just getting to the point where women just had had enough. They could not see a way out of their predicament anymore. And the final one, I think, is a really interesting one, this idea of gambling being an unforeseen harm. And I perhaps point your attention to Phoebe's quote towards the bottom of the slide. One of the things that was quite striking about the sample of women that we spoke to, and might not necessarily be reflected in other research, where we know that sometimes there is comorbidity and people may also be using things like alcohol and other substances alongside gambling. Actually, what was striking about this sample of women is that they were very, very clear that in most cases, they didn't drink, they didn't take drugs, they didn't do any of these other kind of problematic addictive behaviours, if you'll forgive the phrase. But actually, Phoebe, who interestingly was the only woman that disclosed illicit drug use, I think reveals quite an interesting theme here about how, on the one hand, she says, well, I've tried heroin, but actually she's immediately, and has never been a drinker, but she's immediately kind of turned off from that because actually she wasn't able to keep that mask up anymore. And what we're trying to kind of get to here is this idea that gambling for many women is a kind of perhaps more hidden and legitimate way of trying to escape those everyday stresses. And for that reason is perhaps seen very much as a kind of unforeseen harm. Usually the women are actually just using gambling to keep everything together, to keep holding everything together, and they don't see perhaps gambling ever escalating to the point that it does. I'm not going to touch too much on the range of different financial harms here, but as you would expect, a range of different financial harms, losing houses, losing properties, becoming homeless, significant debts, multiple health problems. Again, as I've alluded, sometimes quite difficult to see how those are driving the gambling, sometimes quite difficult to see how they are a consequence or a harm of that gambling. Lots of relationship problems described by the women's problems with employment, including, of course, losing jobs following theft from an employer. And of course, a very clear harm, which I'll come back to, is involvement with the criminal justice system. And just finally, on the final bullet point, this talks about a range of different risky and criminal behaviours. Many of the women in the sample had been prosecuted. Several of them had been sent to prison and then been under probation supervision for an acquisitive crime linked to gambling, normally quite significant theft from an employer. But many women also disclosed stealing from perhaps friends, partners, family members. And there were a range of other different behaviours that perhaps we might describe broadly as risky, including domestic abuse. One woman disclosed how she, in hindsight, recognised that actually she had behaved in quite coercive ways in relation to finances with her partner in order to fund her gambling. And two women in the sample also disclosed engaging with sex work as a means to actually support their gambling, particularly when things were at their hardest. And actually in those two examples, both women were also homeless at the time. So I'm just going to say a little bit more now about the women who've been affected by the gambling of others. And this was a really, really important area for us to also explore, because actually what we felt that is that there was limited information about how perhaps women who've been affected by the gambling of others have experienced not only the crime that might be related to gambling, but also their broader experience of the criminal justice system. So as you'll see, what really came out very, very strongly across the accounts was just the absolute shock and devastation that finding out about the gambling, most often of their partners, had on them. So women often likened it to being like an affair, like being like a divorce, a bereavement, And in fact, often women described it as being in some ways far worse than those things, because actually there was very limited understanding about what they were kind of experiencing. So just as an example, we see a quote there from Emma at the top of the slide. It's, you know, really, again, quite a harrowing story where Emma's 37 weeks pregnant. She has a 1-year-old child at home, and her partner rings her to explain that he's been caught following a very significant theft from work. And as you'll see here, you know, she's about to go on maternity leave. She's very excited. And then suddenly in the moment of that phone call, really her world does fall apart. She knows that she's now ultimately going to be in a situation that she feels is totally out of her control, that's going to involve the police, the courts, imprisonment, and so on. And this really did have a devastating impact on Emma's life. Her partner did end up going to prison. She then describes in quite lengthy detail about being homeless as a result of the gambling debts that he'd driven up in her name, about having to make a career change because she could no longer work in her line of work, and then also about trying to support her partner and 2 very young children as he experiences his imprisonment. So as you'll see on the second bullet point, there's a lot there, but, you know, essentially we really felt that, you know, kind of women who we might describe as affected others were really left picking up the pieces, and often, you know, having to take responsibility for particularly things like finances and debts, but also all the other harms that were unfolding around them, but often not really knowing kind of where some of those harms were and what all the different pieces were. So Nicola here talks about, you know, never anticipating picking up the pieces and then never really knowing how the pieces even go back together. And this kind of constant stress that follows from having to do that, which I think if you look at Tara's quote, again, it illustrates well this kind of sense of really almost having to put themselves and their own challenges to one side in order just to really kind of firefight in many respects, and just to try and find out where all the different debts are and how to get through the every kind of day in terms of finding those debts. So understandably then, women affected by the gambling of others often felt that they were quite isolated from services, and that many of the services and resources that are available tended to be reserved for the gambler, and that often tended to be the immediate priority in terms of picking up the pieces, you know, finding out where the debts were, making sure that the gambler was able to, or the person gambling was able to enter into recovery. And just finally want to pick up, and I'll come back to this in the next slide as well, but just pick up on Nicola's kind of comment there. And there were some other ones I was looking at when I'm putting the slides together from other participants who talked very much about this sense of being trapped. So women often described, you know, the experience of having lots of loans and debts taken out in their names, essentially having been victims of fraud, sometimes having also been victims of quite coercive and abusive behaviour, but not really knowing where to turn, because actually sometimes the idea of involving the criminal justice system was felt to potentially actually make their situation very, very much worse. So as Nicola says there, you know, you don't want to be the person that puts the father of your children in prison. And similarly, other women spoke about, you know, not wanting to ever bring up the gambling, or not wanting to leave the person that had been gambling, because they were just very, very worried about what that person may go on to do. And they didn't want to be responsible for them either being homeless or perhaps taking their life, or any other kind of, you know, very, very, very damaging consequence that could follow from it. So what I want to just talk to a little bit more on this slide is just some of the perhaps experiences of kind of criminal justice or crime related harms that women affected by the gambling of others disclosed to us through our research. So as you'll see, you know, there was kind of multiple and significant long-term harms that affected others described to us, including those relating to crime. So more than half of the sample had, you know, been victims of fraud themselves. Several of them also disclosed experiences of domestic abuse, sometimes very, very serious incidents of that. And some of the other things that we found that affected others we're talking about were things like intimidation. So, for example, we have Anna, who's in the top left-hand corner, who talked about Anna was a daughter of somebody who'd been gambling, and affected other who was a daughter. It's her father who'd been gambling. But as a result of his gambling, actually, there were people making calls to the house, people following her from walking home, people ringing the mother and actually making threats against the family and the children because of outstanding debts that had been driven up by her father. And as you can see here, what actually follows is that Anna now has this terrible situation that follows, where her mum's essentially said to her, you know, you need to walk home with this particular young gentleman from school rather than walking home on your own, because of concerns around what the people her dad were in debt to might do. And as you can see, Anna's now in a terrible predicament where, you know, you can see the very clear themes of victimization that follow. If we look at Julie's stories, you know, a particularly harrowing one. You can see here very, very, you know, kind of serious experiences of domestic violence for a very, very long time, actually, through her period. And as you'll see from the kind of bottom half of her quote, eventually her ex-partner actually turns up at the family home with a knife, with a petrol lighter, so on. And she genuinely believes at this point that he had come not only to take her life, to kill her, but also of her children as well. And in this event was a very sad ending. The man involved actually did set fire to himself, thereby taking his own life. And of course, Julie is now still picking up the pieces and dealing with this in terms of her young children, and dealing with coroners, and dealing with a whole range of other different kind of relevant agencies. The second bullet point here is a really clear themes that comes out with affected others around the shame and anxiety that many affected others often felt or were made to feel, importantly, about having facilitated or profited from the gambling. So you'll see the quote from Nick at the top, which is that, you know, even though the police are advising her that the Crown Prosecution Service are very, very unlikely to take the case forward, or if they did, that her partner would get a very limited sentence, she was still being treated by many different institutions, particularly financial institutions, as if she'd been complicit and as if she'd benefited from the gambling of her ex-partner. And similarly, if you can see from Tara's quote, there was a real sense from some of the women about quite negative experiences of going through the criminal justice system, in this case, the police, where Tara describes being woken up at 3 in the morning by a whole team of police officers who are searching her property for something related to a financial crime that her partner had been alleged of being involved in. And they're really treating Tara as if she kind of is complicit. You know, you must know, you must have an idea of where this thing is that they're searching for. And of course, Tara at this moment has just found out that her partner is suspected of quite a serious crime and actually may very, very likely go to prison. So it's perhaps not the experience that an affected other needs at that particular point. Okay, so just kind of the final area I just want to talk to is just looking at experiences of criminal justice services. As I've alluded to in the last kind of couple of slides, actually there was some quite negative experiences, particularly for affected others who are often treated as quite complicit or as responsible for the gambling of somebody close to them in their lives, and then as having quite limited options in terms of trying to resolve the situation and move forward. Just thinking about the women who had disclosed gambling and then having also committed a crime, as I've already said, many of them were prosecuted, many of them did go through the criminal justice system. There were some of the women in the study who disclosed criminal activity, but for which they'd not been prosecuted of. So this is particularly about those with direct experience. As you'll see, you know, all of the women kind of felt there was a real consensus that the criminal justice system really has quite limited awareness and or concern really for gambling. So even when women were disclosing and raising gambling as a really very relevant issue to their offence and to their case, there was kind of really very limited understanding or concern for it. And this was something that women reported at every single stage. So from their experiences with the police, through to prosecution, through to prison and probation services. So as you might expect, because there's kind of quite limited understanding and awareness, while some women did describe some empathy from criminal justice actors, in practice, they also reported that there was very limited provision of support and that really they were given very little throughout any point of their sentence, either in prison or on probation in the community, to help support them with their gambling. And the lack of services, and we did also ask women about their other experiences of services. So this is perhaps a broader point, but sometimes the lack of understanding and services that women reported, they really felt added to their kind of feelings of isolation and shame. It reinforced that, you know, gambling was something that women just didn't do, and that's perhaps before you added in things around the crime. One of the things that comes across many of the women who, or all of the women who had gone through the criminal justice system, was the experience of very long delays. Women often were very, very forthcoming with the police about exactly what they'd done, often describing it as a sense of relief to have been caught. But despite being very forthcoming and you know, kind of admitting everything, disclosing and giving the police all the evidence, there was often very long delays in their case. Lots and lots of uncertainty then about when a prosecution would proceed and what the outcome at court would be. And we also felt that in many respects, some of the sentences, this was of course a qualitative study, but they did really appear sometimes quite inconsistent with one another. So very, very different outcomes that women experienced. But that sense of kind of being in limbo, as you can see from Louisa's quote in the middle, and that sense of having to wait for punishment was really seen by the women as being very disruptive to their recovery, and, you know, very, very problematic. Just a couple of final points then to go through. You'll see from perhaps halfway down the bullet points, there was a real lack of recognition of gambling cultures within prison. So fantastic quote there from Hannah at the bottom, who really talks about, you know, how actually, you know, gambling is something that might go on informally in prisons, but actually gambling is also something that went on in a much more formal basis. So Hannah there is talking about playing bingo with other women in the prison, and also the prison officers who would help call out the numbers. And as she says, you know, you wouldn't encourage us to do drinking games or anything like that, but here you are encouraging us ultimately to gamble. So we really felt that this was a really significant problem. So, you know, they kind of added together this lack of perhaps understanding, this lack of awareness around gambling, lack of screening across all of these different criminal justice services, coupled with actually sometimes almost what we might call an encouragement of gambling, really made in many respects that criminal justice sentence largely pointless beyond punishment. So women are there really being offered very limited support, being really offered very limited understanding, but at the same time potentially being encouraged, or certainly being able, if they wish, to continue gambling while under a custodial sentence. So I think I'm going to end there. I've just put on the final slide just a couple of links to the final report, not only the women's report, but also the link to the final report of the Commission on Crime and Gambling Related Harms, which Liz introduced you to at the beginning, which it kind of draws together all of the different criminal justice research that they've done, and it's actually a very, very good summary of what's being done. And then finally also to Liz's research around gambling and crime. So thank you very much. I think what I'll probably do is unshare my screen because I can only see my slides, so I feel very disorientated, and then perhaps catch up if there's any questions and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It was really interesting and important research. I'm sure there's lots of questions which people have been thinking about. It's certainly got me thinking about some issues. So I think I'm going to hand over to Vanessa, who's going to, and I'll help you keep an eye out, Vanessa, for if anyone's got questions. So let's pop your hand up or ask in the chat, or just go from that.
So nothing in the chat so far. Sam, yeah, would you like to ask your question, and then Elvira? So Sam first and then Elvira.
I would. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks so much for that, Julie and Liz. That was absolutely extraordinary, really fascinating. So I'm going to ask about, so a project Joe and I are doing together is about responsible gambling regulation. So actually I did wonder if at any point, you know, the industry were involved, were any of the participants in the project encouraged or forced or invited to stop their gambling or reduce their gambling through the gambling providers themselves as a result of responsible gambling regulation, or was that not an issue at all?
I think, I mean, Julie can probably add to this, but I mean, there was a range of experience where some of the gambling was fairly historical, before those safer gambling measures had been put in place by operators. And obviously this has changed, certainly over the last year or so. Operators have become a little bit more vigilant. I would say that sometimes operators had exactly the opposite effect, and that they would pursue the women who were experiencing the greatest spend and the greatest losses as well. You know, there was tales of people being sent mobile phones to help them gamble, presents on their birthdays, you know, endless free bets, VIP passes, all that sort of stuff. I'd like to think that some of those practices are less common now, but they certainly haven't stopped. But I don't think, from memory, Julie may be right, Julie may correct me on this, but I don't think any of the sample had experienced any sort of intervention by an operator to try and prevent them from gambling beyond their means, or questioning them as to whether or not they were experiencing any difficulties whatsoever. Julie?
Yeah, I certainly don't recall it. I mean, we were very led by participants about what they wanted to explore within the interviews. They're often quite long interviews. One of the things that came up, Liz has alluded to very strongly, was the use of things like VIP schemes and repeat emails, and you know, kind of being sent things like iPads. One woman just described being sent all the way to Las Vegas by one of the operators in order to, you know, essentially continue gambling. So some very, very you know, kind of high rewards. But importantly, that these were often happening when they were trying to sort of reduce their gambling, or were trying to cease gambling. And you know, the two words that I'm sure the report kind of refers to that women used themselves were feeling that this was a kind of form of grooming, that this was quite predatory, and that it was something that really had, you know, made things very challenging at a point when they were trying to start on recovery. The woman Emma, who I spoke about the woman who'd been 37 weeks pregnant when her partner had been found and arrested for a gambling related offence. He had actually previously you know, ended up stealing from a different source in order to fund his gambling, and then had gone through a period of recovery, and she was very, very upset as an affected other that actually one of the things that had tipped him back into gambling was being sent a kind of, you know, particular offer, and that getting through some of the blocks that should have been in place. And you know, as hopefully I've illustrated, we can see the kind of ripple and the corresponding effects that particular email or practice may have had. So it certainly was there. I think Liz's point is important. If you think about our sample, you know, these were women essentially who had probably already been through the criminal justice system and were now perhaps on the other side, if you can use that phrase. So I would hope that some of those practices have changed, and I know that some of the kind of guidance around some of those practices has changed. So we are perhaps talking about women who were gambling at a point where there perhaps was less protections than I would hope there are now.
Thank you. And I think, Elvira, you had a question next.
Yeah. I think I have two questions, and probably they are big questions, both of them. I mean, one is in relation actually to someone who gambled, and another one is about affected others. Like the first one, I mean, I don't know if the case, but I just wonder if it came out. Some of the participants were the ones who kind of started gambling very late, and you know, being at home or out of stress. Or one of them said she was in she was at the menopause kind of period, and I wondered, of course, if anything came through in terms of how in these sort of circumstances they were, you know, they started. Like, was it actually marketing? Was something they've seen advertising? Like, what made them to turn to gambling? And the second, I guess, second question was about affected others. I mean, it was quite interesting to see this whole, you know, the complicity, you know, where others are kind of victimizing this affected others. So this is quite, to me, it's quite shocking kind of finding. And I wonder if this was, across sample, a prominent sort of finding, because if that's the case, I mean, this could be like an important, aspect to manage and monitor, like, because you mentioned that, for instance, in banks and in other, organizations, this women, they just can't get through. They are kind of seen as companions of this, of their partners. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. So in relation, if I understood the first question about perhaps some of the women who were starting gambling much later in their lives, or were escalated, I suppose, much later at their lives, at least 3 women in the sample, and it was obviously a small sample, but it's obviously qualitative data, did raise and highlight that they felt the menopause had been relevant to their gambling. So some of the women, in fact, 2 of those 3 women had gambled through much of their lives, largely unproblematically, but they felt that actually it was at this point where their gambling started to escalate. The other woman, who was actually the woman that's quoted talking about it, had never gambled and couldn't almost explain why. One day she was kind of watching the TV and entered a competition, but she won big on that one day, and then found that she kind of very quickly got drawn back to it. I think that more kind of research and understanding needs to perhaps go into perhaps the relevance of women's health to gambling, but I think it's like all of these things, it's so difficult to untangle what else is going on. So this is not women saying, well, I hit the menopause and I suddenly started gambling. Actually, this is about where women were in their lives at that point. So often actually, perhaps long-term relationships, sometimes quite troubling relationships, have started to break down. They're really now feeling quite unsatisfied at work, unfulfilled. There's, kind of multiple other set of things all coming together at that point. So
I think, the reason why I ask, because it's interesting how sometimes we see operators, opting in for this sort of non-stereotypical advertising approaches where they clearly target females.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm kind of wondering that they are trying to obviously perhaps in this way expand the target and exposure. But so this is where I came from, because I thought perhaps she's seen a sort of advertising content that was like particular oriented towards females. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a daytime one, and I think it, perhaps the best explanation that she was able to, I think women often found it quite difficult to really pinpoint exactly what it was, but I suppose it is that kind of constellation of different stresses, traumas, feelings perhaps of isolation, boredom, feeling unfulfilled, and then, actually, why don't I kind of give it a go? And actually then kind of finding that things have started to spiral perhaps much more quickly, this idea of it being quite unforeseen, that it spirals really very quickly. In relation to your second question, I think it's a really important one, and it's something we really wanted to emphasize in the report, was, really what I would kind of call secondary victimization of victims through the criminal justice system. I have a lot of concerns about the limited support and services that are available to people who have gambled, but this sense that actually women who, most often have ended up perhaps being victims of crime themselves because their partners have taken out considerable debts in their name, who sometimes have actually also been very, very abusive within the home, and they're having to try and care and put everything back together, look after the children, look after wider family members and so on, are then turning to various different services, particularly financial services, sometimes things like the financial ombudsman, to try and obviously have, in terms of disputes around money, but then sometimes also the criminal justice system, where things have been really serious. And actually, many of them were describing these senses of being held accountable. You should have known. Why didn't you know? Reinforcing much of that shame that many of the women described. But also when they were then being given advice, actually often seeing that their options appeared to be quite limited, because, actually the only way you can proceed with this and not be accountable for this debt in your name is to now proceed with a prosecution against your ex-partner and the father of your children. So women finding themselves in this really, really almost impossible situation where they don't feel that that's necessarily something that they want to proceed with. And I think this extended to other institutions, and it's definitely something that more research needs to be done on, I think. So one of our participants talks about some really challenging experiences of going through the family courts as well, and about the family courts really having no or very limited understanding about how gambling and some of the kind of financial and coercive control around gambling was relevant to her case and was relevant to the care and the custody of the children. So I think we've started to scratch the surface. I don't think I've got by any means a full picture, but I think it is something that we definitely feel needs to be explored much more. And perhaps just finally I'll say on that, in terms of the criminal justice system, some of the experiences that women had at the hands of the police were hugely problematic, essentially being seen as being complicit. I'm going to add one final thing.
I mean, the quote you had there is just, shocking, kind of.
Perhaps add one final thing, just to perhaps be devil's advocate. One of the things not in any of the quotes that I showed where the women were talking about being complicit, but certainly a couple of our participants did disclose how perhaps they'd been involved with perhaps extending their mortgage, but on the basis of information that they shouldn't have given, or essentially kind of engaging with somewhat fraudulent activities in order to try and clear the debts associated with their partner's name, or nearly engaging in fraud to try and clear a debt. And of course, that added to the sense of being complicit and responsible, because actually on a few occasions, some of them had maybe stepped over that line or had in order to protect themselves. So it's a very, very, I think, messy and complex space, because I think sometimes women probably are pushed into actually having to do that very thing that we found that they were being accused of.
I think I would just like to, just on Julie's last point as well, add to that the shame and stigma that comes not just for the affected other, but also for the gambler as well. And there is that conversation that can go on within the couple or the relationship. It doesn't have to be partners, it could be kids or parents, whatever, of wanting to support the gambler and recognise that their gambling is a mental health issue and that the problem is with the behaviour and not the individual, and they want to stay with them and support them. And it's about keeping it secret. It's about keeping it within the family or within the partnership. And so people, the affected other or others, can almost become complicit then in trying to they would see it as bringing about support for the other person, when actually sometimes they can be making the situation a whole lot worse, because there is so limited public awareness of where you go in this sort of situation, either as a gambler or as an affected other.
Thank you. And I think we've got Maria next, and then Andrew Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Liz. I have lots of questions, but I thought I had one question about screening in the criminal justice system, and I guess I'm really interested because it was one of the first things I learned, about just what's not being done that you think should just be kind of obviously done, which is to screen prisoners for gambling harm, and I'm just interested, given that you've done this research, what your kind of take on it that is now, given that there are some, I think, experiments to try to introduce screening into various prison populations and into, police forces and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Maria. I mean, Liz might be able to talk a little bit better to some of the other Howard League commissioned research. Certainly, as Liz mentioned, they were looking at, other colleagues were looking at policing, and Lauren Smith also looked more broadly around screening. I mean, there certainly have been pilots, and I think things are improving and moving forward, but my sense is that it still seems to be quite piecemeal, and it really depends on where you are within the criminal justice service. The other challenge I found, a couple of the stakeholder participants we interviewed were very senior prison managers in a couple of women's prisons, or across the more broadly across women's prison policy, and they actually talked about how they'd kind of done a needs analysis and tried to identify how gambling might be relevant to the women in their care, but actually that they'd kind of almost come back with a very low figure and therefore didn't feel that it was necessarily something that was critical or something that they could justify allocating resources to. And I think one of the challenges here is, and as we found almost as a research team, is about really meaningfully understanding how crime and gambling might be coexisting and overlapping, because You know, for example, one of the prison managers that we spoke to said, well, women probably aren't going to want to disclose gambling to us, particularly if it's, you know, going on informally within prison, or perhaps it's linked to coercive control from their partner, and actually they might not even entirely recognise it as relevant to their offence because they might be convicted of, for example, a drug crime or a theft crime, and actually the gambling was related, but that's not what they were convicted of, or they weren't convicted of an acquisitive crime related to that. So I think there's some really clear challenges with getting that data and then knowing almost what to do with it. I certainly understand that people are obviously making lots of attempts to try and start doing that, but I think it's difficult to direct services towards it until we have a much better picture.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the final recommendations of the Commission, was the development of screening and assessment processes and guidance and training, whether it's in the custody suite or the prison or in probation services, wherever. But the important thing is it's throughout the system as well, because people are unwilling to sometimes disclose any crime related to their gambling because they don't know how that will be seen. When it comes to their prosecution, whether or not the magistrates would look favourably upon that, or whether it would have exactly the opposite effect. And throughout the projects of the funded by the Commission, what's really comes through is the inconsistency. You know, there's good practice in little pockets, and then there's bad practice or no practice in other pockets, and it's that inconsistency which also makes people, you know, really reluctant to disclose.
Yes, thank you. I think the next question is from Andrew Ryan.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation, Julie. That was really insightful, and it really got me thinking, and it's probably off the back of the previous question as well. So I'm working within services delivering treatment offers, and I'm just wondering if either through the research participants or generally through stakeholders, or just in your experience of carrying out the research, was there much conversation and feedback on access to support and how sporadic that was experienced or easily that was accessed? And also, particularly for the research participants, how did they experience the approach of the support as well? Because what I'm starting to hear is that people actually want to have this conversation, but unfortunately professionals are holding back on talking about gambling as well. So there's a bit of a mixed response out there. So I'm just wondering how kind of forthright people are in being able to have the conversation, or maybe this echoes back to a previous point where we might be unconsciously obeying a stigma and not talking about gambling, because it is about mental health and well-being and kind of more holistic approach. Yeah, because I'm very aware that I'm doing a piece of work at the minute across the West Midlands with the prison estates, and the prevalence survey has been put on hold. And again, I'm curious about how do we instigate that conversation. And finally, sorry, it feels like loads and loads, and I'm trying to get you to answer many questions from a service angle. Were there any points of kind of on someone's trajectory or relationship with gambling where support would have been best placed as opposed to waiting for crisis?
Okay, Andrew, I try and do my best with that. I mean, I think it probably reflects the sample, you know, people that are willing to come forward to the research, that, you know, actually all of the women had to some degree engaged with services at some point before speaking to the research. But there were, in my view, many missed opportunities along the way. So women had often spoken to things like GPs and felt that they'd been fobbed off really, either with medication for anxiety, depression, or with very generic counselling where they felt that there was very limited understanding of gambling. And actually how those experiences sometimes were quite counterproductive, because they'd kind of almost got to a point where they recognised that they really do need some help and support, but then almost being kind of fobbed off with something that doesn't really deal with the gambling specifically. It perhaps reflects, the sample and the fact that perhaps people are talking about experiences many years ago. What was really interesting was women's experiences of things like GA, so Gamblers Anonymous, how women described those as being very male spaces. Sometimes they felt they were quite predatory, that they weren't spaces that they felt particularly safe or comfortable in. Women described being followed home and that, you know, kind of almost, you know, being chatted up and finding that actually this was a really unpleasant space, and it just led to them saying, this is not for me. but also just sometimes the access to services being really challenging when people are also trying to juggle childcare, all of those other family responsibilities, and the quite kind of sometimes rigid offering or delivery of services, sometimes just not fitting in with that, you know, kind of wider life that I've tried to describe. So I hope that's as best as I can. I didn't go into the broader treatment narratives around women, but you know, they certainly did, you know, kind of talk to those themes.
That's great. Thank you, Julie. Yeah. And
Thanks.
I recently had a conversation with Gamblin, and I know they've got some peer support groups set up that are women specific.
Mhm.
And they'd indicated that people had had some difficult experience with other more kind of formulated mutual aid groups as well. So it's interesting to hear you say that. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
If you
Thank
want,
you.
sorry, Andrew, there's been quite a bit of work being done on that in Betknowmore. So if you do want to contact me at all afterwards, then by all means, ping me an email and I'll put you in contact with relevant people.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you, Liz.
Fantastic. I think we're nearly coming up to an hour, but I think we've got time for a question from Sharon Martin.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a really interesting seminar. I just really wanted to mention a couple of things, I guess, rather than a question. That I thought it was fantastic the way that you highlighted the lack of understanding about gambling and gambling harm. And I thought it was particularly interesting where you, one of your participants said about bingo and the way that kind of activity is somehow not really defined as gambling, so that therefore means that maybe, you know, it's not defined as something that is potentially harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought it was really interesting that you talked about, or some of the sample talked about, the kind of sensory appeal of gambling and the kind of idea that maybe sometimes it was the loudness and the brightness, but other times it was the kind of the sort of dark and quiet space, because that ties in with I'm not going to remember who said it, but stuff that's been looking at the sort of sensation and how that appeals as well. So yeah, I mean, there was loads that was interesting, but I just wanted to say thank you, really. And I thought those 2 points were just two I'd highlight.
Yes, thanks, Sharon. And I think that kind of sense about how gambling sometimes can be that really quiet space, I think we were hoping to get to in our title as well, this sense that women are really just trying to hold it all together, keep everything going. And there is a point, whether they're somebody who's gambled or perhaps is affected by the gambling of others, where it just gets to that kind of catastrophic point and they're then left trying to kind of pick up all of the and resolve all of the harms there. So so yeah, thanks for your comments.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we've hit 1:30, so I think we probably want to wind up now. I've just noticed, Liz, you've very kindly put your email address in the chat, which is very kind. I think, I mean, everybody has said how, you know, enlightening the talk has been. We've had a really good attendance, and I've just been looking. We've had a really big mix across people from Bristol, external, from gambling harms, and also criminology. So really has talked to many different people across different spheres. So thank you very much again for joining us. And as I say, we will be putting the video up for colleagues who were unable to attend today, but very much appreciate your time. So yeah,
Thank
virtual
you.
claps all around.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye
Yes,
now.
thank you. Bye.